Yeah, thanks, Paul. Hi, good morning, everybody. Stan Stahl of SecureTheVillage here, and welcome. We're just so glad you're here today. It's our fourth annual webinar on reasonable security, what every business owner, every business leader needs to know. So we're going to hear from, we got a great panel today. We're going to hear from everybody in just a few minutes. I want to first, before we do that, kind of set the stage for what's going on right now, why we're here, and ultimately, in part, why October, because it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We've been doing these webinars every October now. This is our fourth one. It's just a part of what SecureTheVillage does. Why we're here, I mean, in a sense, small and mid-sized businesses are being forced to improve cybersecurity. Why? Well, first of all, based on Verizon studies, 5 out of every 8 incidents where confidentiality, integrity, availability has been damaged, 5 of every 8 of those hit mid-sized and small businesses. Based on CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 of those 5 will be out of business in 6 months. So that's the financial, that's the immediate hit, if you will, why businesses have to improve. But then surrounding all of that come 3 other major pieces. One is the laws, the regulations, the implications, both on the privacy side and the security side, have been getting tighter and tighter and tighter. California Consumer Privacy Act just being one illustration of that. Second, cyber insurance is getting more and more difficult to get. You have to have certain security controls in place just in order to get cyber insurance. And the last phase is ultimately businesses are drowning in so much noise, it's hard to pull the information out of the noise, right? You got vendors, all of whom, nothing against vendors, everybody's got a product to sell, but they're all selling their product, not, okay, what do we do in the big picture cybersecurity of all of that? Implications of that are enormous. Let me just look up some numbers. Well, that's good. That's not the intent. Let's see. California, these are reported losses from the FBI. In 2021, $1.23 billion was taken out of California businesses by cybercrime. That's what's reported. Estimates are that's less than 10% of the total. So take them with a grain of salt. 2022, the reported numbers jumped to $2 billion. And the critical thing there, that's a 60% increase over what it had been in 2021. That's why we're here. I mean, this stuff is, you know, it has gotten to epidemic proportions, and ultimately we have to act on it. And that's what brings us here. We've been looking at this SecureTheVillage really since 2018. We put together what became our IT security resource kit. Many of my panelists have been speakers there all the way back at that earlier one. We, as part of CCPA, we put together a minimum reasonable information security practices, a list there. Right now, we are just launching a pilot program with a grant from the Center for Internet Security to take 25 IT service providers and 25 businesses and nonprofits and measurably improve their cybersecurity using programs from Sightline Security, the Center for Internet Security, Cyber Readiness Institute, the NIST framework, and also building in a special business development component as well to help the IT service providers be more effective at their security. So with that, we're going to move into, let's talk to our panelists. Here they are. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. And as part of that introduction, I want them to leave you to state, and we'll discuss it further, the one thing they want you to, each panelist wants you to remember when you walk. If you could only remember one thing, like what is it? In my case, and I'll lead off, I want you to remember to turn I know to I do, to we do. Cybersecurity is a team sport. It's not what we know, it's what we do as a team that's going to matter. That's my one idea. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, turn it over to one of my, like to say, my favorite panelist, David Lamb. I say that in jest. David and I have known each other for 20 years, and those of you who know us know how much fun we have with each other. So, David, why don't you kick it off? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what's your one thing to remember?
So, Stan, thank you for having me. I'll save my insults of you for later, given that such a lovely introduction, and it's a pleasure to be back with many of the same faces and some new participants. So in 1991, I was at UCLA, and for 6 months we were going to be the largest Ethernet network in the world, and we were thinking, hey, could that be a problem to put several thousand students on the internet? And keep in mind, this is 10 years after the advent of the PC. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and so I made some great friends, including the FBI, who came by a couple of times a year. For me and our team at Miller Kaplan, this is all about helping others get more secure. How do we find effective ways? And I love what you said, Stan, is how do we get rid of the noise? How do we define a path? How do we talk about what's reasonable? The big thing I want to, lead with today is IT is not information security. Different disciplines, they're different perspectives. And on top of that, part of the information security function is governance. And governance means that IT is fulfilling its promise to the business. And you cannot go to IT and say, hey, IT, how are you doing? You have to have someone else do that. And this is a very, very important division to drive home, is that in this process, you do need the subject matter expertise. And you need subject matter expertise that you can tell from these panelists around the table. You need IT, you need insurance, you need privacy, you need law, you need forensics. God, do we ever need forensics? And so it has to be a team with players with very specific skills. So thank you again for having me, Ken.
Thanks, David. Well said. And I'm a part of the work that you lead at Miller Kaplan, and it's truly great working with you. So you raised that distinction between IT and information security. One of our panelists, a good friend up in the Bay Area with Phoenix 2.0, Alex Rayter. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Alex, a little introduction, and what's the one thing you want to leave everybody with?
Thank you, Stan, and everybody. It's good to be with you all. I'm a principal at Phoenix 2.0. We're a full-service IT consulting and management firm with a really strong emphasis on information security. Our clientele ranges from tech startups and not-for-profits and small businesses and larger companies that span into the lower middle market across a variety of verticals. So I have a pretty wide purview of what happens with everybody else sans the enterprise, right? So everybody on down who is very much affected by cyber risk and doesn't get the mention in the press or otherwise, or is not being necessarily courted by a lot of the solution providers because they're just too small. And some of these are fairly large businesses, coincidentally. Very huge part of our overall national economy. There's very little guidance aimed at the small non-regulated business, and it's a big problem, like you said. And for me, it all changed in 2017 when we had the two global outbreaks of WannaCry and NotPetya. That really drove the point home to me personally. I'm very interested in the subject matter on the personal level and a professional level. I think the way the world is today with data and the importance of data and how much of an asset and a valuable one it is at that, I think we all need to educate ourselves. So my key control, which spans, technical, administrative, and behavioral, fortunately, is education. I would say security awareness training. I think there are a lot of people out there who still haven't had even an hour of security awareness training. And if they did, I think it would open their eyes in many ways. And so I think it starts with education.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Alex. And Alex is one of the participants in our pilot program as well. Many of the people you're looking at on this podcast, on this webinar, are that way. I want to move next to the legal side of pieces, because that's one of the legs of the stool, if you will. Braun, Bob and I have been friends and colleagues since I think late in the last century. We co-wrote what we think is the first ever article that made it both to an information security journal and to a legal journal on how you've managed cybersecurity. So, Bob, so great to have you here. A little introduction, and what's the one thing you want people to remember?
Well, thanks very much, Stan. I feel gratified that you said nice things about me too, even though I am a lawyer, which I hope everyone who's attending will forgive. Just a background, I'm the co-chair of the Jeffrey Mangel, Butler, and Mitchell Cybersecurity and Privacy Group. Our focus is, as you might expect, on cybersecurity and privacy. In terms of a client focus, what I like to tell people is that we are really interested in clients who have a commitment to privacy and security. We're really not into, we don't believe that our time is well spent with people who are simply trying to check boxes. If you want to just check boxes, that's pretty easy and get a lot of people to do it. I think creating a truly secure atmosphere and really respecting privacy is something that takes true commitment, takes a lot of understanding of your own business, and it requires a kind of culture, a corporate culture, which often doesn't exist. In terms of my one big thing, it really leaps off Alex's to a great deal. My one big thing is eternal vigilance, because over the years, I will say that no matter what a company's defenses are, no matter what their systems are, no matter what your training is, that one slip by one person can overcome all other measures. So it doesn't matter how good your security is. It all comes down to the individual, all come down to the individual user. I know we're not supposed to gloss on it, but I did know someone who used to say that everywhere you go, you're expressing your brand. And if you really want to create a secure environment that it respects privacy, you really have to consider that every waking moment, and perhaps some of your dream time also. So.
Yeah, well said, eternal vigilance. And you're so right that one slip, our defenses are not 100%, and they never will be. I mean, that's just part of the reality of where we're at. And that's the perfect segue off to you, Brad Maryman, another longtime friend, FBI retired. Brad's who you call, when the bad stuff happens, but you should have called him or people like David or Barry or others before it happened. But you see what ultimately, Brad, leads to tragedies, to businesses going out of business, to those sorts of things. So tell us about yourself, and what's the one thing you want people to know?
Well, thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it, Stan, and for the kind words. After 30 years in the FBI, I started Maryman Associates in 2001 to provide some of the same resources to business that agencies and governments were able to provide. Forensics, to piggyback on David's earlier one, we come when all else fails. And the one thing I'd really like to impress upon people is that no matter what size your business is, be prepared for bad things to happen, because they certainly will. Whether you're a Fortune 100 or a mom and pop or a small SMB that's 50 people to 500 people, every one of those segments is susceptible to compromise. And don't think that you're too big or too small not to be a target, because every organization, anything that's facing the internet is a target. There's no question. And although we get to help a lot of people, sometimes it's to recover, sometimes it's to learn exactly what happened so they can avoid it the next time. But sometimes it's actually to save the businesses before they go under, both from an insurance standpoint and from a recovery standpoint. So for us, it's gratifying to be able to come in and do those things. But it's, again, that big takeaway is that this is kind of like the plumber. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Everyone, every organization, and probably every person at some point or another will succumb to some event, whether it be large or small.
Well said, and sadly so. But what you're saying is so true. And one of the metaphors I've begun using is to just compare and contrast, kind of what cybersecurity is keeping ourselves safe, protected, analogous to safe driving 100 years ago, before there were traffic lights, before there were yield signs. Brakes would often not work, tires would explode, drivers weren't trained, and so on. And my sense is that's kind of where we're at today in this environment. And that's, to your point, Brad, always be prepared. I want to segue up to you, Barry, next to jump in. Again, you and I know each other a long time, and it's a great, working with you and seeing your perspective, because again, you got a privacy perspective as well to the other things that you bring to the table. So please introduce yourself. What do you want us to remember?
Dan, thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to participate. And I love this panel. I mean, this is like the best of the best sitting here. My background is I ran IT organizations for a few decades before I decided to personally pivot. And I learned exactly what David said a few minutes ago, that everything I knew about IT, I had to look at it with a different pair of glasses when I started focusing on delivering security services and getting certified in that space. Like, oh my God, I thought I understood this. No, I didn't. And then I pivoted once again to privacy and said, oh my God, there's a whole new world out there. And now I breathe a whole lot easier when clients say, I've got an attorney that we're working with, like Jeff or Mangels, that know privacy and security, because it's not the same thing, that it's a different world and it's changing constantly. Yeah. We sit at SecureTheVillage, I'm a partner at SecureTheVillage, we sit in the middle of all of this, helping organizations that have compliance requirements to implement privacy and data protection programs. And that means implementing the appropriate policies, looking at what they're doing with personal data and mapping that, helping to provide the information to attorneys like Bob to help write policies, implementing the required processes to deal with requests from consumers for their rights and so forth. So it's sort of the glue. We help organizations operationalize this, and we act as virtual data privacy officers and vCISOs as well. It's an interesting space. We talked earlier with others about what we do, and a lot of the space I find I fit in is helping to translate what people are saying when they talk about IT to the business, when they're talking about privacy to the business, when they're talking about security, and translating for each other, because it's a complicated space, but manageable. It's something you just have to implement in steps, like everything else. And the one thing I'd like to leave people behind is that two words: data minimization. There is a wild card in everybody's deck of cards that they've got, which is, if you don't have it, you don't need to protect it. So on a conscious basis, every organization should be thinking about what data they have, they do not need, and get rid of it. Don't collect it if you don't need it. It's sort of contrary to what marketing wants to do all the time. Collect all the data, keep it forever. But what you don't have to protect, and you don't have to worry about any compliance requirements. And it should be a conscious activity.
Yeah, well said, definitely. Yeah, you can't manage what you don't know you have. And
That's true too.
also, yeah.
And if you already have it, get rid of it.
That's right. As soon as you can. Don't be a pack rat, I guess. Great. Our last panelist, Isabelle Dumont, is new to us. We're so glad you're here, Isabelle, representing the insurance industry, because that perspective and your perspective on that perspective are so valuable. So glad we've had the opportunity to meet, and looking forward to you participating on the panel. Tell us about yourself and what do you want us to remember?
Thank you so much, Stan. I'm so grateful to be part of this panel today and joining this group. So a bit about my background. I've done a lot of things across technology and IT, but most recently I've spent the past 5 years in cyber insurance after spending about 10 years in cybersecurity. So at Kaplan, we were mostly focused on insuring small and medium-sized businesses about cyber incident. And I got to tell you, there's so many times where when there's a claim being filed about a cyber incident, whether it's ransomware, whether it's invoice manipulation, whether it's any other kind of incident, this is typically the worst day in the life of the person reporting the incident or the life of the company. So I love everything that has been said, all the recommendations that have been made. Preparedness is very important, having a culture of security, all of that is important. But I also want to go back to what Stan started us with, which is it's not about what you know, but it's about what you do. So my word of wisdom for everybody out there is start today. We all know that cybersecurity can be really daunting when you look at it. There's so many technical aspects. You might not have the resources. It's very complicated, but there's very simple things you can do today. I think it's a good time right now with October awareness to take advantage of all the resources available. We're getting very close to the holiday season, where we know there's going to be a lot of scam on personal account and so on. So it's also a good time maybe to train employees. If they understand the challenge of security on their personal assets, it's just going to be so much easier for them to understand it on your business assets. So get started today. Give them access to a little bit of training and how to recognize a phishing email, how to have a strong password, and so on. That would be my advice. Thank you.
Very good. No, thank you, Isabelle. And what you say about connecting, helping people at home with their security, their privacy, and training, helping people understand it at work, those go hand in hand. Those amplify each other, and that's a whole part of the Secure the Village. That not only are we about the business thrust, which is today's webinar, but we also very active in helping the community, helping individuals and families. We've just published our new updated guide to basically how to avoid being hacked for homes, for families. That's available on our website. I want to move on. I want to take these 7 ideas that we've all expressed, and I want to put them in a framework. So I want to share my screen again just for a moment, just to lay out this framework before we start jumping into the discussion. Okay. Basically, there's 7 kinds of things we want to be paying attention to when we're looking at cybersecurity. There's the management leadership aspect, which we've heard all of these 7 things in the things that all of us have been talking about just recently. Management and leadership, the framework. Okay, where do you start? What do you look to as guidance? Laws and the government and so on. The management of third-party risk, which is now becoming very, very relevant, and particularly it hits IT vendors, IT service providers, Alex and some of the stuff, David, that we do at Miller Kaplan and Bob in legal contracts. There's the IT security piece. I mean, Barry and David, you both talked about that in your own way. There's the need to control information. One aspect of it is minimize what you've got. There's the cultural things, and there's the be prepared. So we're going to spend the next chunk of time. It's 25 after, so the next, probably 45, 50, 55 minutes, talking about these 7 things, very conversationally. We're going to start with you, David, bring you back into it. Your whole idea, and you talked a little bit about it, was the difference between IT and information security. Let's begin there and how you separate out those 2 functions. And you talked a bit about governance, what that looks like, and so on, why and how they're different. Let's start there, and we're just going to go.
So I was telling the story yesterday, Stan, to Megan, who's on our team, that in 2002, we had an incident, and we were apprised by our board we had to retain cybersecurity expertise. And our board member, Warren Reed, said, here's 3 names, but you're going to hire Stan. So Stan, I remember after we had signed contracts, you showed up one day with Charles Crescent Wood's textbook of controls.
Yeah.
And you're like, pick the controls. And this reminds me of what Alex said, right? The guidance for small organizations is awful. What do? People are like, deer in headlights. And Alex, as you know, and I'm sure everyone around this table knows, most IT providers don't have this sense of where that bar is, right? Are not cybersecurity educated. They're skilled in IT. The very first thing we need, and it's funny that you're asking me this question because I learned this from you, right? Is the very first thing we need is the bar. What are we going to do? Right. And I love the NIST cybersecurity framework for this. And because the cybersecurity framework says you're going to build a target profile and decide what you're going to do. And then you're going to start doing it. Now, what I love about the SecureTheVillage work is that there's all this community discussion as to what that is. Wherever you start, you got to start. And I think I'm stealing from Alex again, just do something and get going in that direction. For us, it's always about vulnerability management. It's always because folks can't see in, they're not seeing the vulnerabilities. And so once we start scanning them with a reputable vulnerability scanner, we're starting to see things and we're able to make progress. The progress can't just be in that area though. It has to be in the management structure. It has to be, meeting monthly, making sure you have your team together, the subject matter experts, and that you're making progress. You can't just meet for the purpose of saying, hey, we got together. And then you have to make progress on both the management front. We talked about security awareness training, how important that is. We have to make progress to, address the privacy and the data. But we're just going to do it the tiniest bit at a time, month over month, and slowly move ahead, respecting that you need the multiple members of the team. You can't move ahead without knowing what all the pieces are. And just as I would not ever deign to attempt a forensic investigation without contacting Brad's company, you've got to make sure the right people are executing.
Well said. Well, surprisingly well said, in fact.
Yeah, well, it was just a bit imitation of you. So,
but what you said about the, getting started, it amplifies what you said, Isabelle. Barry, you and I have a webinar, something about don't try to boil the ocean around that. When you look at data minimization, first of all, you got to know where your data is. Right there are lots of big waves coming at you when you can't boil the ocean. You want to jump in and, reflect on that piece of it as well, based on, taking what David said?
Sure. Was that me or was that Isabelle?
That was actually you, Barry, and then I was going to go to you, Isabelle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I come from the privacy perspective most of the time, that's where my head is. It all starts with a very important concept, which flows really, really well into what you should be doing with cybersecurity, and that's data mapping. Data mapping starts with the question, whose data are you collecting? And you could say that whether it's about individuals' data or what kind of data you're collecting for the business, whether it's transactions, whether it's inventory, whatever, what data are you collecting? And then you go to the next step. Okay, where am I storing it? And where am I storing it? Then it transfers into, okay, where do I transfer it to? Does it move anyplace else? Then you can ask the question, how are you protecting this data? So you get an overview of what is the landscape? It's a map. It's an actual map of what's really going on here. And it's critical to the privacy world because all that needs to flow into documents that Bob Braun would help with, like the privacy notice. It tells you what it's all about. And then it gives you a foundation for saying, okay, let's even take a step back. Whether we do or don't do an overall security risk assessment, it's easy to pretty quickly say that particular application has most of my most important data. I can start there. I don't have to do everything. I can start there.
Yeah.
And you can expand upon it one step at a time, but it starts with first defining what is the landscape look like.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, what do we got? And how sensitive is it? Where are the crown jewels and so on? And Isabelle, I want to now jump over to you because I know you had some thoughts as well on this. So please, yeah.
Yeah, so I really like what Barry said, and there's certainly a process to go to understand the data you store or don't need to store and so on. We often say that, oh, small businesses are not as well equipped, they don't have the resources, it's harder, but I would say the opposite when it comes to data. It's probably a lot easier in a smaller business to know the data you have and to organize that compared to a very large business. So for once, there's an advantage in being a smaller business when it comes to security. But to go back to what David said, and to how I started, it's like, start by being prepared. So of course, get your data organized, and that might take some time, but you can start today by saying, okay, what would I do if an incident happened? Who do I contact? Very often when a cyber attack takes place, it can create a little bit of panic inside an organization, and everybody start to run and jump in all directions, while knowing who's the point of contact. There's very often a lot of legal implication, data being stolen, and so on. You have to have your SWAT team be there ready to control all the various workflows that need to happen in a discussion and who interface with the outside and so on. So, work on a basic incident preparedness. Your cyber insurance, whether it's covered or not, should have some template for that, or any of our panelists here probably have some guidance on that, but there's resources out there to really walk you through, and in a couple of hours, you can probably have something decent in place.
Yeah, well, good said. And that point of knowing in advance all the people you're going to call and so on. Brad, I see your hand's raised. You're one of those people that needs to get called as early as possible. So jump in.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I just want to parlay everything that Barry and Isabelle just said, and especially when Barry was mentioning, do you even know what you have? One of the first things that we ask for when we come in during the cyber investigation and incident response is, we need logs and all these types of things. We also need a network map, and we need a data map. And I can't tell you the number of times that we go into a company and they say, what's a data map? Okay, well, it's a map. It's a logistical assortment of where all your data exists. And if you're doing it right, it also says what type of data it is and its importance. You cannot properly protect yourself if you don't know what you're trying to protect and where it's located.
Right.
Mapping, or even if you don't call it a map, let's just say you just go discover all the places that you actually have content, and determine, is this, okay, what level of protection does this need? Sometimes there are compliance issues about a particular type of, like, PCI type data. There are mandates about how you have to protect that. But on others, it's less about governance and more about how important is it to you as a liability that your client's information, or that your customer information, or even your own investors, or your own company's information is being protected. And if you don't go out and try to determine exactly where it is, what it is, and what levels of protection it needs, you're tilting at windmills. You really don't know what you're trying to accomplish, and you're not going to accomplish anything, actually.
Yeah, no, and that whole piece is first of all, so well said that way. I mean, we're all amplifying the same thing, and we're also pointing the discussion off to you, Bob. I mean, you're the attorney, you're the guy who's going to have to clean up, who's going to have to advise their clients on the legal ways, the legal things to do to clean up the mess. Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, well, I was gonna, I mean, I agree with everything said. Isabella made a very good point. It's odd to talk about the importance of an incident response plan, and when we're talking about security, I think a lot of people would say, well, wait a second, talk about security. Why do we need an incident response plan? I think what we said before, and perhaps Brad said, is that, oh, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. Unfortunately, it does mean probably, if not the first call, one of the very first calls that you have to make is to your lawyer, an outside lawyer, because behind every, beyond every successful man is a woman behind. It's terribly sexist these days, but behind every data breach is a lawsuit, and right behind it, and you have to protect the privilege. But there's another point about having the incident response plan ahead of time. Really, two things. One of them is that you can't, it's like not having a plan is like building a ship on the ocean. When I go to a company that has had an incident and they don't have a plan to pull out and take a look at, we have to do all the things that you need to do. We have to assemble a team. We have to figure out who are potential forensics people who, for me, it's really easy. I just call Brad, but, but who can you call? Who are your lawyers going to be? Who are your PR people going to be? Who are, there are all sorts of things you need to do to guide it, because it's, frankly, although it's overseen by legal, it's not generally a legal process. We come in at the beginning and then we analyze what's happened at the end. But the other part, and the advantage in creating an incident response plan, is it is a knowledge exercise. It's an exercise in understanding what resources you have available to you. And it's also an exercise in understanding who is a responsible person in the organization. I mean, one of the things that we always say, who is your ISO? Who's your information security officer, or your chief information security officer, something even smarter. And they say, well, it's Jim. What does Jim do? Well, Jim actually is one in charge of the file room. So great, what does he know about it? Who really knows and who's responsible? And then finally, there's nothing like having a tabletop or a real exercise to see what works, because it just builds in muscle memory, so that you don't immediately, I mean, I go on about this, but so that you don't freeze up, and also so you focus on the most important parts of an incident response plan, like containing the issue, as opposed to the least important plans. Well, who did this? Which is not all that important. I mean, there's a point at which you want to know, but it's not a big deal. Someone from Russia, I can say that. So anyway, that's my initial diatribe today.
No, well diatribed, if I can create a verb or something out of that. This whole subject of readiness. We're preparing a tabletop for a client whose IT, they're small, they're tiny, their IT provider is one person, and the tabletop's simple. Network isn't working. You call your IT guy and he's not available. He's in the hospital with COVID. He can't talk to you. What do? That's the essence of the tabletop. And we're very curious with this particular client. We don't see them that often. Have they even begun to think through that? And if they haven't, better they think through it before the incident than after that were to happen. Yeah, staying on the subject of kind of this preparation, Alex, when you're working with your clients, I mean, there's Phoenix 2.0's own internal preparation, okay, but then there's also the expansion of that to your client's readiness, not just your readiness to support them with things like we've been talking about, data maps and so on, which, nominally are not part of the IT responsibility. How does that kind of play out? And, I look at you as your ground level, you're in the day-to-day that way. How does that play out with you?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Wow, so much good stuff has been said. I'm just taking notes here.
Yeah, I hear
great,
you.
great questions in the Q&A as well. I hope we get to some of those. Well, it's as somebody that a small business hopefully calls, and hopefully before something happens, right? It's my job to have a stable of partners that are data privacy, data security, attorneys that do incident response firms, and forensics people. It's the client. They should call the attorney first, but often they call the IT, right? And again, hopefully before the incident starts. And it's our job to quarterback all of those relationships for them. Cyber is a category of risk like any other. It's like force majeure events or financial headwinds that may be happening due to the economy or physical supply chain. So what do business owners do with other categories of risk that we're all used to living with? They go talk to a professional. The professional gives them a program they can follow and some guidance. The issue has been in cybersecurity is that the guidance and the programs haven't been meeting the small business people where they're at, right? That's been the unfortunate part. And so we've all been relegated, especially the IT firms and cybersecurity providers who do work with smaller clients, SMB, lower middle market. We've had to come up with our own distilled version of NIST and CIS implementation group 1 and all these things. And we sort of got the idea from CISM and from the Australian cyber director, who came up with easily digestible thing called the Essential 8. In our case, we've made it the Essential 12 because we wanted to add a few more things because some of our clients are a little more mature. But these are top level key controls, like the kind Isabelle wants to see on a cyber insurance application. They're technical, they're administrative, and some of them are physical controls. For example, data classification rubric, right? Using a rubric that you can pull off the internet to classify data and then maybe do a data mapping exercise. That's a great way to start the governance conversation. It's impossible to do any kind of data classification or follow a rubric without having marketing at the table and finance at the table, because that data is going to span marketing data, financial data, unstructured data, all kinds of stuff. That is a great way to start. And it will produce IT documentation. It'll get the governance conversation going, right? You will have to talk about risk. How valuable is this data? What if we lose a subset of this data? What are the ramifications? How will we respond? So all this stuff kind of flows, right? One thing into another. And like everybody said, you have to start somewhere. Just start, talk to a professional, right? We do have templates available for a lot of the governance documents, IT, network diagram, IT documentation, business continuity plan, acceptable use policies. We have working templates we can give a client in a matter of a day or two. We can customize those to at least that they have something in place where they can apply for cyber insurance or show that to a third party and demonstrate what Mark asked in the Q&A. Is it some kind of a defensible cybersecurity posture in the event that you end up in front of a judge, God forbid, because there's now private right of action in California, that you can say, look, we were doing all of these things that are considered reasonable security because there isn't such a thing as 100% security. Yes, we had an incident, but we were we were good stewards of our third-party data. We called the attorney, we followed their legal guidance, we've communicated openly with the affected parties, et cetera, et cetera. We have a defensible cybersecurity posture. So, you know, I know I said a lot there, but I think the main takeaway is talk to a professional, start somewhere, and one thing will lead to another. It's a program, right? So like, you're not going to boil the ocean, like Barry says, but you have to start.
Yeah. Yeah, and well said, and bringing up that question of defensibility as well, because, and again, on the one side, Bob, that loops back to you. You also brought up the whole idea of you can give your clients templates and acceptable use policies and things like that, but then if they don't go through the exercise of implementing them, actually turning "oh, I know" into "we do," to use my quote, Bob, it would seem to me you're putting yourself at more risk if you don't follow your own, here's what we're going to do.
Yeah. I mean, I for a long time I've explained, when people have come to me and said, look, I need a privacy policy, can you draft me one? And I explained to them what actually is involved in privacy policy. They say, no, I just want a privacy policy. And I used to say, no, I'm not going to do that, because if you have a privacy policy but you don't have the underlying procedures to actually comply with it, and then you've created more liability. I mean, if nothing else, the FTC will get you, among others, a lot of plaintiffs. You know, I'd say from one point, legal or not, I mean, having the procedures, having the technology and not using it, why? I mean, why would you do that? I mean, we regularly find people who have bought good software but didn't turn it on. You know, it's like, oh, I've got this fabulous system for my house, this alarm system. I just don't turn it on because it's a pain to have to press 4 buttons, you know, every time. At least that's what my wife says, but I don't really tell you. But you know, that's you know, to me, it gets back to the issue of creating procedures and policies and systems that can be followed. That if you have, especially for this, for I think what is our audience here and who are my clients, you know, if you can spend $100 million a year on privacy and security, like some companies do, you probably have pretty good privacy and security. If you can't, if you're somebody that is the difference, you know, that whatever you spend is something you're not going to spend on marketing, not going to spend on R&D, not going to spend on your people, and you're going to put your company at risk, you really ought to be rethinking what your approach is. You know, frankly, I think that there's a lot of complexity that, because it is technology oriented, or people feel it's technology oriented, that people tend to glaze over, and they tend to throw money at it instead of brains at it. So I'd say that if you have simpler, more understandable policies and procedures and technology, and if people really know what they are, really know what they have available to them, and don't have, you know, it's sort of like when we create an incident response plan, not to harp on that, we have about a 15 or 20 page typically plan. We have a 1-page summary, you know, and it says, call this person. What do you do first? What do you do second? And then people can go back and they can, you know, they can read the source material on it, if you will. But having things that people can do is much better than having beautiful stuff that people can't do or won't do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's another related piece of that. That is that even if you write something simple, if management isn't behind it, if there's no governance, if there's no leadership saying, yeah, we didn't do that just to put it on paper, just to be compliant with something. We actually need to implement it. It takes leadership to implement policies.
We've been saying that. How long have we been saying that? Literally decades. We've been saying that. Yeah, so it is so true. If the people,
because nobody else is motivated.
We said it in the 90s. We said it in the 2010s.
Yeah, one day we'll listen. But
we're in the 4th decade of saying that. Yeah,
It's still true. It's still true, because everybody has what they think their job is.
Yeah.
And they're going to do that first.
Yeah.
Until someone says, sorry, you still have to take out the garbage.
Yeah.
You still have to do things.
That's
That's
right. Yeah.
Yeah. And we struggle with that, David, between, and it goes back to something you said earlier as well, Bob, is the check the box mentality. We have some clients that, wow, they can't wait to get started on this, let's go, let's do it. I met with one of them yesterday. And then we have other clients. I met with one of them a couple of days ago. Once a year, they call because it's time to check the box. So, once a year. And do they do anything between box checking time? Well, they tell us they think about it. They're planning.
Hey, at least they talk to him once a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Stan, Kim Ryle posted a question in QA about, some of the main reasons company gets started with cybersecurity. I think this is an interesting point to, there are some folks who, are doing it simply to check the box, and it's very risky. I don't know if you want to answer that question, or another panelist wants to answer that question in terms of what turns someone from the box checker to the believer, other than getting
Yeah, have an incident. You'll be a believer.
Yeah.
Hello. That is the most. There's two things. There are two things that are guaranteed to get organizations implementing privacy and security programs. One is a very positive reason. They've got a customer that is demanding they do it, and they want to keep that customer. It keeps revenue coming in the door. They do it. The second is they've had an incident. The third is, oh, by the way, they've got a compliance requirement, and they realize they have to. There's significant risk to the business, if they don't meet the compliance requirement.
Jackie Parker posted something related to that. Jackie's a friend. She said that isn't spending on cybersecurity also spending on customers and marketing, employees, and so on, and talks about it making an opportunity cost by making it an either or spend question. I think it's definitely a possibility. I would say that we keep that there's a continuing attempt to promote privacy and security as on a value added basis, that given the choice that customers would rather work with a company that is secure aware and privacy aware. So it may be the case. So
Yeah, how much of it though is, and I'm old enough to remember seatbelts, when seatbelts were not regularly part of cars, and then we got seatbelts and then shoulder harnesses, and they began to be required legally, and people would say nobody's going to force me to put on a seatbelt, and now, at least for, I would think, the vast majority of us, we get in our cars, we put on our seatbelt, we don't even think about it. And then we're going through a transition of that kind. Isabelle, I want to bring you into the conversation on that point around how many businesses that you see that are just sell me the policy, just okay, here it is. I don't want to do anything though. Don't make me implement MFA or these other things. What's that look like again down at ground level when you're actually talking with clients, with prospects?
Yeah, and I want to use that opportunity to wrap up many things that have been said. The reality is nowadays it's probably really hard to get a cyber insurance without having some of the basic in place, or showing that you have the intention and are actively putting them in place, which I think is fair. If you MFA is free on most email platform, there's a lot of training people is not that much of a burden. But I want to remind everybody that what I keep saying is security can't be a project, it's a practice. And you have to practice every day. And you have to encourage your employee to practice every day when they sign up into systems and they use password and so on. So It's almost has to get close to having a culture of security, and that starts with awareness and education. But again, you can't. It goes back to, you don't just check the box. You have to live and breathe it. When it comes to cyber insurance, so we've been. The reality, people might say, "Oh, it's just a contract, and we have to pay, and we never know whether we're going to be covered or not." The reality is, the cyber insurance have your best interest in mind. If they have to if you file a claim, they don't want anybody to file a claim. We don't want anybody to have claims. We don't want anybody to have incidents. So they have the business best interest in mind, and they're starting to line up quite a bit of resources to help to make sure that those basics are in place. Because if you're in a small and medium size side of the equation, most incidents come from either people's mistakes, basic security not being in place. So the bar is still pretty low to raise your security to a level that's acceptable and it's going to do really decent protection for your business.
Yeah. And what you say is as well there. This whole issue of culture takes you right back to leadership and all. Brad, I want to reflect on something I've heard you say around leadership. Actually, I want to reflect on something I've heard you say about the absence of leadership. Let's talk about that. The number of times you've been brought into a situation, you've done the forensics work, you've given recommendations to the client. So, okay, here's what you got to do moving forward. And then you find yourself back in with that same client. Those, which to me are leadership mistakes, lost leadership opportunities, lost culture change opportunities. You want to tell us how bad it can be that way?
Well, I mean, it is. And my favorite one like that is brought in on a particular client's, it was a breach of their network, and it cost them money. It cost them a great deal of money because it shut down their website, which was their sole source of business, for several days. We've told them what happened, how to fix it, and then they could put it back up. Well, they understood what happened, but they didn't fix it, and within 24 hours they were breached again. And we told them, well, it's a different group, but they use the same window to get in. Same story. A few days later, after being down, they went back up, and for a third time within 7 days, they were breached again. At which point we says, well, I don't even have to look at it. I can tell you what happened. But if you're not going to do anything about it, then, why spend money on my services or anybody else's to tell you what you already know?
Yeah.
So they were in business for about another 3 months, and then the credit card companies actually shut them down. They says nobody will take their business any longer.
Yeah.
So some of these, and that was a mid-sized business. They had been doing relatively well, but we also had a company with, this is $1 billion company, international company, with contracts with organizations all over the world, and they had their lead IT person thought the rules didn't apply to him. A couple of stupid mistakes, and they were breached through him. And within, I think it was probably within weeks, about 3 weeks probably, they were out of business because all of the contractors broke their contracts because they said that you're in breach of all these. So they lost $1 billion company, went under because of one person's silly mistakes. And it wasn't anything more than he wanted something that was easier to do than what he was being required to do.
Mhm.
So I mean, so for me, leadership, it's at every level. I mean, it's leadership in IT, it's leadership in security, it's leadership of the entire organization. It is a top-down thing. I mean, it needs to run throughout the entire organization, from the very highest levels to the very bottom levels. I mean, to the most recent hire who's in the mailroom or something. It doesn't make any difference. Part of their indoctrination and their onboarding needs to be, hey, we can all be brought down, fairly quickly if we don't, follow the rules. If we don't try to make sure that we're protecting ourselves, our clients, our customers, then it's all for naught. So for me, it's an embracing of a security culture. It really is. And in today's age, it's hard for me to understand why a business person does not understand and accept that.
Yeah. Well, and your story about $1 billion company going out of business. I mean, and again, think 100 years ago of automobile driving, right? Versus today, and even today, the odds of being in a car accident are tiny. 1 every 18 years on average, Americans get into car accidents. And some of them are simply annoyances that, you take care of. But automobile accidents are the greatest cause of death of kids in America. I mean, that's how serious a car accident can be. We all recognize that. We drive safely. We don't stop at red lights because the law says we have to, right? We stop at red lights because it's in our culture. It's in our gut.
Right.
We don't even see the red lights, but we see them, if you know what I mean. I mean, we're not, they're there. They're in our consciousness that way. It is that leadership, and it is that embracing, getting it in our gut. And I want to jump off to you, David, because I see your hand up. Yeah, go for it.
I wanted to build on what Brad said and a question Jackie Parker posed earlier, and that is, we need all the help we can get in conveying this message. And as a risk manager, Jackie points out that risk managers and company leadership have this tendency to sort of put risk management aside within cybersecurity. And so this is very interesting because we're missing an opportunity to be communicating with leadership in another language that maybe they'll hear. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on this, because I know the frustration that Stan and I and our team have with the box checkers is, how do you convey that this is important, other than you're going to go out of business, which is then dismissed because there's no view. And so does anyone have a thought, or at least I really struggle to convey this message. And when I've had the chance to work with Jackie, she's done a good job of putting the language in business risk that can get attention where I have not been successful. And I see Mr. Braun is asking to chime in, so I'll yield the floor.
No, feel free. But I think you're actually talking about two things, because it is a cultural issue. It's a business cultural issue. I don't know that it's that well, it is difficult to get people, decision makers, to weave security into their analysis. But the people who are at the top of business, they are supposed to be the people who analyze risk. And so that becomes a excuse me. So when you do put it in terms of risk, and you say this is a business risk, and here, and it's like any other risk, and even though it sounds strange and there are different words, it's no different in terms of there are tools to analyze that risk. As my partner Michael likes to say, you can assess you can ascribe a degree of risk to the unknown unknowns, and there are books about it, and you forced me to read a couple of them. But I do want to bring one other thing there, is that it's a broader issue, because it's not in the same way that that a commitment to security won't work without the top being involved. It's also not solely a top-down issue. This is part of the general problem that we have, or the general challenge that we face, of loyalty within an organization altogether. Since virtually every person in an organization, and actually you could spread that out to vendors, to third parties, in fact, even to customers, that if they do not have the same degree of urgency and commitment that you would like, this system isn't going to work. And unfortunately, we're in a stage where there's not a lot of loyalty within cultures. And that's a conundrum. We face it in our business generally, because I will tell you, people are not loyal to a paycheck. They're loyal to people. They're loyal to other things than just money. And frankly, for a lot of people, especially when you get down to the rank and file, saying that there's a risk, they don't believe it, because they've never been treated as if they're important. So why should they believe they're important? So I think loyalty is that we have to face that part of the culture as well. And I would yield to Brad, who is much more succinct and much more accurate in what he says.
I want to jump on and just say I agree with everything Bob just said. I mean, it's loyalty throughout a company, but I will disagree that I think some of it is top down. Is you establish loyalty and you establish a culture starting at the top as you build your company. When you were a 2-person company, you became a 5 and 100, and then a 500 and a 5,000. That culture, comes along with you, and it's important for those people. Just as we have mentors in every field, including security and the one we're in now, businesses had mentors since, I guess the beginning of time. So those mentors' ability to transition or impart that same loyalty and urgency about need to protect the organization, it comes from those people. And hopefully it's something that resonates throughout it. But I really wanted to jump on one of the things that David mentioned just a moment ago, and that was about how do you get the people to actually do something besides check the boxes? And for many of them, and depending upon what the issue is or the particular box, it may be more difficult than others. But some of them, and again, we've kind of hit throughout our talk today, is that some security is better than no security. Some preparedness is better than no preparedness. Some plans are better, than no plans. The same thing with the box checking. Many of the boxes that require checking, there's a resistance because they don't know how to do it. This is requiring me to do something I don't understand. I don't know enough about IT or information security to be able to accomplish this. Well, that's why you go hire someone, or you send someone from your organization to training something. But some of them they're inexpensive. Some of the boxes that need to be checked actually cost them zero. As Isabelle had mentioned earlier, and I think Bob did as well, you buy an expensive product and then you don't configure it appropriately, or you just leave it in defaults, which means it's basically protecting nothing or not doing any of the things that you would hope that it would accomplish because you spent a lot of money on it. But taking the time to actually go in there and configure it appropriately, or to set up, as Isabelle says, multi-factor authentication is free in many of the applications. Yes, you can use Duo and some other things to add on top of that, or replace it if it's not available to it. But for most of them, it's literally checking a box. So you have checked a box by checking this box. And it's as simple as that. And I think if we can relate to our customers and clients that type of ease of compliance, that it may be able to push them forward to at least get partially into a better security posture than they were before.
Yeah, well said. And I want to jump in just and promote our pilot program for doing that. I mean, that's exactly, I mean, it's okay. How do we help small businesses through the educational challenges that are needed and so on around this? And that's what the pilot program is. So I encourage everybody to go take a look at it. Barry, you're up.
I've got two answers I'd like to share. One is that the loyalty thing is, I think, significant. We've got one client, and this is, I think, indicative of the industry, but it's important to understand this. It's a real business question. Loyalty starts not only with people, it also starts with the mission of the organization. We've got one client that's a nonprofit. Everybody in the organization is so dedicated to the mission. So what I do with them is, okay, first off, we catch somebody who has, we're using Zscaler in there because everybody's remote. It's a tool to offer a remote firewall, for instance, and it inspects data. And we can catch phishing acts before they reach a phishing site. Not significant. That's not significant story, but I can see these things that have occurred, and then can call people up and say, "Did you know what you did then?" And never blame. It's not about blame, because people, it's really hard to catch this stuff. And then, without naming names, I'll share it with everybody and say, "Oh my God, I learned about that. That's cool." And it's like teaching it in a positive way, but based upon the loyalty, everybody wants to learn. That loyalty is really significant. It's a business issue. The second thing that Brad mentioned is MFA as an example. Yeah, some of the security controls are free. They can actually make your life easier too. I mean, for Google Workspace, and I believe also in Office 365, you can not only turn on MFA, you can tell it to say, if I'm using the same device, don't ask me for a password, just log me in. You've got two things already. And you can set it for a period of time. So you can actually make life easier getting into applications, because you're actually using multi-factor authentication. So it not only can be free, it can make life easier. Yeah. There's lots of benefits, but I agree. You need to call Alex to help you get an implementation of MFA the right way, so that you can take advantage of the tools that can not only protect you, but make your life easier also.
Yeah, well said, Alex. Go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Wow, great conversation. A couple of things. The division of labor was mentioned. Really, it is really important. So, for example, we shouldn't be auditing our own work as IT people. I mean, there are IT providers that are very security conscious, but the audit assessment function needs to live outside of IT, right? And so the onus is on the IT folks to bring in a cybersecurity specialist to do security operations center type monitoring, to do penetration testing and vulnerability scanning. We can do a little bit of that, but we shouldn't really be doing most of that work. Incident response, obviously. So that's an important distinction. Also, security awareness training, I've seen when it's done well, it's a great builder of culture, not just security culture, but just overall company culture, because it's gamified, people are having fun, it builds a sense of ownership and shared responsibility. I mean, it's different even from just, other types of training where people kind of go through it. Yeah, we know we're not supposed to sexually harass our coworkers. I get it. Let me just, scroll the way down and hit, accept and complete. The security awareness training, when it's done right, is very interactive, right? And it's gamified. So it's very effective for culture building. And, the conversation David mentioned, this kind of like, how do we talk about business risk in an effective way? We touched on this last year in this webinar, right? And I think I mentioned that, the times where I have the most success is when I talk about general risk, and cybersecurity is just being another category of risk. It happens to be a major one that's preoccupying us for the last, 5-7 years. But, at some point we'll get over this, we'll make a lot of headway and it'll be something else, right? We'll be back to focusing on pandemics or whatever, right? I mean, and so when I talk about it that way, I think people let their guard down a little bit. And the point being is it's a highly probable risk. It's highly, highly probable. The question that you have more control over is kind of the impact, right? Jackie is asking great questions. Insider threat. A lot of people are unwilling insiders, right? That's, again, training can help with that. They're often duped into becoming an insider. When it's a person who's intentionally intent on being a threat actor internally, there's very little you can do about that yourself. Again, hopefully you've got the respond and recover functions of NIST well in place, so you can have some guardrails, right, and prevent this person from wreaking a lot of havoc. Or if an outside entity is doing some kind of auditing or assessing of your organization, they may be able to better spot it, because we're not prepared to spot insiders in our own companies. That just, unless we're running some kind of if it's a government entity or some kind of very secure environment, yes, but otherwise, we're not well placed to see these people, right? That's the whole point. And so identity access management is huge. Log review, log aggregation, log review, that can help a lot. But again, these people know that these things are in place. They often know that they need to have some OPSEC and where they're covering their tracks and being very devious. So that's a hard. The intentional insider threat is very difficult. So, but again, I think like I think Brad mentioned this. Some is better than none. Like we all said, get started, do something, do a little bit of start with some basic training, right, and build on that. So,
yeah, and well done. And then that whole subject of the intentional insider, it's in part a resource question, because big companies, again, Bank of America, I'm told, spends $2 billion a year on cybersecurity. And when we're talking about small to medium-sized businesses, we're talking about businesses under 20 million, under 50 million, under 100, certainly under 500 million or $1 billion, not $2 billion on cybersecurity alone. So it becomes a real challenge. Where do you put your resources? And that goes back to, and I'm not sure whether it was David or you, Barry, around just using it was you earlier on, Barry, getting a good perspective of the data map and knowing where your crown jewels are. And then very specifically, you can monitor who goes in and out of where those crown jewels are kept. Again, a resource question. You can monitor it. Do you have the resources to review the logs? Again, or is it the log simply there so when you get called, Brad, now you can figure it out after the fact? I mean, these are not. And I guess this is part of the whole essence of this. These are not easy questions to answer. It's the same. Fred Samuelin had a question about the cloud, and how one gets one's arms around managing that. It's really all 7 of those things we talked about, with the recognition that the devil's in the details, always in this field. The devil is in the details. Very
some of the answer also comes back to risk.
Yeah.
If you perceive there's a significant risk there, you can increase the security controls for that risk, for very specific risks. You can say, you can turn on data loss prevention. Office 365 has very good data loss prevention capabilities, and Google Workspace has some good data loss prevention capabilities. But it takes expertise to configure that, and then do you have to decide the questions of, do I actually block something or do I notify? There's all sorts of process that you have to think through. But if you don't perceive you've got the risk, then you won't follow on that path. But if you do perceive there's a potential risk there, you can take additional measures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gee, kind of a novel idea. Let's secure things appropriate to the harm that could be caused.
Exactly.
If something bad were to happen to it. Proportionate cybersecurity. I think, David, you and I wrote about that 15 years ago, probably, maybe in that first set of policies we developed at the Temple.
Something like that.
Yeah. All right. this has been great. I'm looking at the clock, and we got 10 minutes. So it's time to kind of wrap it all up. What we've heard from the discussion, how it ties back into the one thing you want people to remember. And let's take a minute apiece and run through that. And Isabelle, let's start with you. We ended the first section with you, so we'll start the last section with you.
Thank you, Stan. So my idea was really get started. So we talked a lot about the various resources. One of the things I wanted to add, we're not quite there yet, but cybersecurity, good cybersecurity is soon going to be viewed as a competitive advantage. You know, if you're a local bank and people know you've been hacked, you're most likely going to start losing customers, and you're certainly not going to get new ones. And the same is true for any business. So I think we're getting there. So getting ready and being vocal about it, and having leadership paying attention to security is really important. I know the media is not helping, because all we hear about is the large businesses, the casino of the world being hacked and so on. But the reality is it's happening every day to small businesses. So again, get started today, even with free resources, even just talking about it.
Get started, exactly. Even just talk about it, make
Yeah.
it the subject of conversation regularly. Don't save it just for the training programs. Barry, off to you. Final thoughts.
I would reemphasize the concept of just realize you need to get started, come up with a plan with clear definition of steps by time frame. That makes it bite-sized chunks, but with a well-defined understanding of what is the next step and when is the expectation of getting it done. So you allocate budget associated with the plan. This is part of standard, do a risk assessment, define a remediation plan with incremental steps that are appropriate for the business and ideally appropriate for others as well, so it's balanced. But you don't have to be unreasonable to the business in doing this. Bob could probably talk a whole lot more about that.
Yeah, very, very well said. Brad, pick it up.
I'm going to pivot away from my one big thing about being prepared, because there was one area where I thought we were a little light in today, and that's third parties and downstream vendors, or when we're a downstream vendor ourselves. And there's the new reality is we can only protect what we can protect within our own organizations, yet we should be held to that standard in our dealings with upstream and downstream partners. And I know Bob is very well this, because he helps write that into the contracts but between some of these vendors. So I think that's something that plays both ways. It's a security risk in dealing with vendors who don't comply with these things, but it also makes it's the value added benefit where you do, so you become a more trusted partner upstream and downstream to try to make sure that you will not be the weak link in the chain.
Yeah, that's and well said again. Don't be that weak link. Don't be the one that the chain breaks with you, and like the oil pipeline on the East Coast. Don't get there. Bob, Brad
don't
raised some legal.
Yeah, don't be colonial.
Yeah.
I don't. It's. I think that anyone who's listening can understand that it's how difficult it is really to grasp this, because there's so many. The fact is, there's 7 people, 7 really different, with overlapping views. None of us disagree with each other, but we all have a lot of views. I would say, I sort of not so much emphasize what I started with, but really what I've come up here and listening today, some great ideas. One of them really goes back to, since we live in a world of limited resources, I think, as Barry pointed out well, one of the most important things to do is to actually analyze what your risks are, and tailor your security efforts to your risk. There, and again, it's really easy to throw money at it. We always joke that if you gave us an unlimited budget, we could exceed it. But the fact is, if you spent time identifying risk and really what your greatest risks are, and if you didn't have, and if you can avoid a failure of a failure of creativity, a failure of imagination, to understand that that's part of really understanding that, not just doing the obvious, you probably get the best solution, and you probably make it the easiest one to implement because you've identified and you understand those risks as they relate to you. They're not intangible or somebody else's problem.
Yeah, and that again, that's a segue over to you, Alex, because down in the trenches, you're going to have to implement those solutions as far as they exist in technology, and you're going to have to make sure that your client knows the limits of what you can do with technology that now goes back to them. So wrap it up from your perspective.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of directions we can go in. I'm already looking forward to next year, and maybe we can
Number 5,
pick up with some of the questions in the Q&A that are still left unanswered. These are complicated questions, but again, I think a healthy understanding of risk awareness education, I think is maybe that's a selfish thing. It makes it a lot easier for me to talk to a prospective customer when they have some awareness of the subject matter and the risks involved. So, and I'll wrap up with maybe a quick story. I have 2 creative agencies. I just realized that this is a great anecdote, and it happens to be real. I just helped 2 creative agencies. One was an approved vendor with X, formerly known as Twitter. The other one with Airbnb. They do creative agency work for them. So both of the principals of the firms, and they know each other. So I got referred from one to the other after I helped one of them. They said, there's an approved vendor process at both of these companies where they issue an RFP for a project or creative project. We have 2 weeks of time to respond with a package of things, contracts, business stuff, insurance, et cetera, one of which is now a third-party security questionnaire. And the said to me, listen, I have 2 weeks to put all this together. I can't fumble around with the cybersecurity stuff, and so I helped them put policies in place, helped them answer some questions. We had to answer some of them in an inspirational manner and help with the implementation, like you mentioned. But next year, he's going to be way ahead of the curve. And if his competitors, who have 2 weeks to respond to that, don't have their stuff together and can't provide clear, concise answers to those questions, they're going to lose the business. And that's where I hope we get to, is where we button down the hatches and cybersecurity becomes a business enabler, right?
Yeah. Right. And we're seeing that happen as well. That same pressure from supply chain partners. David, I've saved you for last. You get the last word. Just before turning it over, I want to pick up on what Bob said, because I know it's something you and I have talked about for 15 years, if not longer, this whole concept of failure of imagination. So take us home, David.
I got a big smile on my face because I remember the first security training video that Citadel made for us, and it was an attack on a Canadian fort in the American Revolution.
Yeah.
And the defenders did not imagine the way the attack was going to come. And you keep saying in the last couple of years, the enemy has a say, the enemy has a say. And so I want to go from my initial summary of, this is clearly a team sport. You need the whole team. You need to pick something and get started. I really like that failure of imagination reference though, Bob, because it reminds us to help people understand that just because you can't imagine a pile of casinos not being able to have their guests get into their room.
God, worse yet, they couldn't gamble. I mean,
they couldn't gamble. And so I think it's a very important thing to remember, that we have to carry that message.
Yeah. It is so true. I mean, and ours is a very technical space. I'm going to wrap it up now. It's we're in the last minute or so. The space is very technical, and Jen Easterly, the head of CISA, has talked about we've got to change the language, and all of us have been talking today in some ways about that change language, what it has to look like, and how we have to perceive this thing, this beast called cybersecurity, get our arms around it. Einstein's great quote that you can't solve today's problems at the same level of thinking that got us here. It's Alex, to your point, needing templates for incident response and mapping and so on. Barry and Isabelle, the idea of get started, appoint it, do one thing, minimize your data. I mean, think about it. 30 years ago, there was no data to be minimized. And now our file cabinets, our virtual file cabinets are overrunning with data, too much of it. It's that difference. And stepping back, sadly, when 5 out of every breaches affect small and mid-sized companies, and when 3 out of those 5 are going to be out of business in 6 months. Brad, your story of that billion-dollar company that lost it because of one mistake. And it was an insider. In fact, it was to Dai's point, an IT person who just didn't want to follow the rules. This is serious. I mean, this is like incredibly serious. I hope today's webinar has been valuable in helping put some context around it all. We're not going to answer a lot of questions as much as help surface here's how to think about this stuff. And you just heard some really, super people, all 6 of you, over the last 90 minutes, each with your own perspective. Cybersecurity is very much like the metaphor of the blind man and the elephant. We all look at it and see it from different pieces, in forensics, the legal, the data, the insurance, the IT in the trenches, the governance, and so on. It's all of those. And in some sense, that's why it takes a village to secure the village. That's inside each and every company is its own village that way. And what we're doing at Secure the Village is to take that and expand it out to the region and ultimately we hope to the nation. I am so grateful to all 6 of you for spending some of your time with us. So elucidating, so informative. And I know we're going to be back here in a year. We're going to be talking about the same thing. Let's just hope and that we've made a lot of progress. And I know we will. We're headed in that direction. It's just the enemy is so formidable. Do not, maybe the last word, change, I know, to we do, and eternal vigilance, Bob, what you said earlier. Be prepared. It's all of those things. Train your people. Get started. Yeah, etc. With that, thank you all, and we're adjourned.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you all.